Picture this: July 8th, 1947. Major Jesse Marcel stands in front of news cameras holding twisted pieces of metallic debris. He looks directly into the lens and tells reporters they've recovered materials from a flying disc. Within 24 hours, that same officer would be photographed again. Same uniform, same confident expression. But this time, he's holding completely different debris and claiming it's just a weather balloon. You think you know the Roswell story: UFO crash, government cover-up, case closed. But the real conspiracy happened in plain sight, documented by the military's own photographers. We have the evidence they never meant to leave behind. The most famous UFO incident in history wasn't just about what crashed in the New Mexico desert. It was about how fast, powerful people could rewrite reality when their first story went sideways. That detail matters. Marcel was so confident this was something extraordinary that he brought it home to his family. This wasn't a man who thought he'd found weather balloon scraps. Marcel had no idea he was about to become the face of the biggest military cover-up in history. Because the moment he brought that debris back to base, powerful people started making phone calls. July 8th started like any other morning at Roswell Army Airfield. Then Colonel William Blanchard, the base commander, made a decision that would haunt the military for decades. He authorized a press release announcing they'd recovered a flying disc. The exact words matter here. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chavez County. Not unidentified debris, not unknown aircraft parts, a flying disc. That morning, Major Marcel posed for photographers holding pieces of the debris. These became the famous proof photos that would later fuel decades of UFO theories. Marcel looks confident, almost proud of their discovery. But here's where the timeline gets interesting. The press release went out around noon. By 4 p.m. that same day, General Roger Ramey had flown in from Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas. Not a colonel, not a regional commander, a general. Within hours of Ramey's arrival, Marcel was posing for completely different photographs. Same room, same lighting, but now he's holding obvious weather balloon materials: rubber strips, metallic foil, wooden sticks. His expression has changed too. He looks uncomfortable, almost defeated. The new story emerged that afternoon. Weather balloon. Simple mistake. Case closed. But here's what doesn't add up. This was 1947, not 1847. The military knew what weather balloons looked like. Marcel was an intelligence officer trained to identify aircraft and unknown technology. Colonel Blanchard commanded the world's only atomic bomb wing. These weren't amateur hour operators making rookie mistakes. The coordination required to pull off this story change is staggering. Remember, this was before cell phones, before instant communication. Yet within hours, multiple military bases, press offices, and government officials were all singing from the same hymnal. But before the military could spin their narrative, they had to deal with a rancher who stumbled onto something that would change everything. Mac Brazel wasn't looking for fame when he rode out to check his sheep pasture that morning in July 1947. The 48-year-old rancher had seen plenty of weird weather roll across his land near Roswell, but nothing like the debris fields scattered across 3/4 of a mile. Lightweight metal pieces that wouldn't burn when he held a lighter to them. Strange symbols etched into some fragments that looked like nothing he'd ever seen. Materials that seemed to weigh almost nothing but couldn't be bent or torn. Brazel stuffed some pieces into his truck and drove home. For 3 days, he just stared at the stuff. This wasn't airplane wreckage. He'd seen crashed planes before. This wasn't from any weather balloon he knew about. Finally, on July 6th, he drove into Roswell and walked into Sheriff George Wilcox's office. Wilcox took one look at the debris and immediately called Roswell Army Airfield. Not the state police, not the federal authorities. The military base. Within hours, Major Jesse Marcel was driving out to Brazel's ranch. Marcel wasn't some random soldier they sent to investigate strange reports. He was the base intelligence officer, a guy whose job was identifying enemy aircraft and unknown technology. Marcel later described his first reaction to seeing the debris field. It covered an area roughly 3/4 of a mile long and several hundred feet wide. Thousands of pieces scattered across the desert floor. Some fragments were as thin as tinfoil, but completely indestructible. Others had those strange symbols that looked almost like hieroglyphics. Marcel and his team spent the entire day collecting debris. They filled the back of a military truck and Marcel's personal car. The major even stopped at his house on the way back to base to show his wife and young son some of the pieces. That detail matters. Marcel was so confident this was something extraordinary that he brought it home to his family. This wasn't a man who thought he'd found weather balloon scraps. Marcel had no idea he was about to become the face of the biggest military cover-up in history. Because the moment he brought that debris back to base, powerful people started making phone calls. Mac Brazel suddenly found himself detained for questioning. Not arrested, detained. For nearly a week. When he finally emerged, neighbors said he seemed different, scared. He never talked about the incident again. Marcel was ordered to stay quiet about what he'd actually seen. Other military personnel who'd witnessed the debris recovery were transferred or warned to keep their mouths shut. Listen to this. Why would they announce a flying disc if they knew it was just a balloon? Unless they didn't know what it was either. Unless the first story was actually closer to the truth than the second one. The military's plan was nearly perfect. But they made one fatal error that would haunt them for decades. They left evidence. Decades later, Major Marcel broke his silence. In interviews during the 1970s, he finally said what he'd been ordered not to say in 1947. It was not of this world. Marcel described the original debris in detail. Metal that was lighter than aluminum, but couldn't be dented with a sledgehammer. Material that would spring back to its original shape no matter how you twisted it. Those strange symbols that looked like nothing in any human language. But here's the smoking gun. Compare the morning photos to the afternoon photos. In the first set, Marcel is holding irregular, twisted metallic pieces. In the second set, he's clearly holding standard weather balloon materials. The switch is obvious once you know to look for it. The weather balloon explanation creates its own problems. If this was really classified military equipment, why not just say classified military test and leave it at that? The military had no problem keeping secrets in 1947. They were literally testing atomic weapons in the desert. Instead, they chose the weather balloon story, which opened them up to decades of ridicule and conspiracy theories. That's not how cover-ups usually work. Other military personnel started coming forward years later. Sergeant Robert Porter, who helped load the debris onto the plane to Fort Worth, described materials unlike anything he'd seen. Staff Sergeant Earl Fulford talked about being ordered to keep quiet about the strange wreckage. The intimidation campaign was real and extensive. Mac Brazel wasn't just questioned. He was held incommunicado for nearly a week. When he returned to his ranch, neighbors said he seemed shaken. He told his family never to talk about what happened. But the timeline still doesn't work. Weather balloons were launched regularly from multiple military bases. Every officer would have recognized balloon materials immediately. Marcel had seen hundreds of weather balloons during his military career. Here's the bigger picture. 1947 was the peak year for UFO sightings across America. The military was already on edge about unidentified aircraft, especially after pilot Kenneth Arnold's famous flying saucer sighting in Washington state just 2 weeks before Roswell. The military was prepared for UFO reports. They weren't prepared for their own officers to go public with physical evidence. Here's what the government never expected. Their cover-up would become more famous than whatever actually crashed. The Roswell cover-up succeeded brilliantly in the short term. The story disappeared from headlines within days. Most Americans forgot about it entirely, but the long-term consequences were exactly the opposite of what the military intended. By the 1980s, Roswell had become the template for how government secrecy feeds conspiracy theories. The real lesson isn't about aliens or weather balloons. It's about what happens when authorities change their story that quickly. People notice. They remember. They start asking uncomfortable questions. Modern parallels are everywhere. Look at how government transparency around UFOs has evolved since 2020. The Pentagon now releases videos of unidentified aerial phenomena and admits they don't know what they're seeing. Roswell proved that sometimes the cover-up creates more questions than the original incident ever could. Here's what we know for certain. The military found something, announced it was a flying disc, then immediately retracted that statement. Everything else is speculation. The enduring mystery isn't what crashed in the New Mexico desert. It's why the story changed so fast, and why so many people were ordered to stay quiet. What do you think really happened at Roswell? Alien crash or military cover-up of classified technology? Drop your theory in the comments. For more deep dives into the stories behind the headlines, tap subscribe and ring the bell.